4. The Jungle. I slept in one great run, untroubled by nightmares or doubtful stirrings in the not-quite-night of my makeshift room. As with the meal before sleep, the wild animal's simple need for rest had overcome me, and I had slept the thoughtless sleep of a beast which boasts no imagination. And yet, once I had risen, eaten, started another of my dry mushroom caps to smoldering in the dark so that the last candle could be maintained, and eventually continued my way along the causeway tunnel, the accursed hauntings of man's nervous innermost thoughts crept back in upon me. The vitalist invulnerability I had felt after crushing the head of my hunter was fast wiped away. Again, the bowels of the earth yawned black and menacing about me, and my mind painted the worst possible sources to half-heard echoes that reached me through the intervening miles of intersecting tunnels. The walk was mostly uneventful that first hour or so, though, and save stumbling upon a trickle of water down the way through some crack in the ceiling overhead which allowed me to drink, and hearing a particularly shrill scream rippling outward from some unknowable place down an adjoining section of causeway, I have little to recall save raised nerves and anxious thoughts. I did not walk long before coming out of the causeway tunnels once more into yet another city cavern, this one much smaller than the first. Like the town along the lakeshore, it seemed to be a smaller annex of the larger and more fortified city core, and lacked the stormed gatehouses and foreboding tiered construction of its grander counterpart. The low moss light was much the same as it had been before, so I was able to douse my candle here, something I was not happy about given the nature of the cricket thing's apparent fear of the flame, but which was necessary to preserve my last light for whatever would follow this glum, moss-lit cavern. There were far fewer signs of struggle between the tall men here, and, to my delight, much more activity in the air above me as bugs and bats flitted to and fro. Something like the song of small frogs grumbled from the spring-fed fountain in the center of the dormitories, and as I knelt and drank there, I was amazed to spot the subtle motion of many tiny glittering fish in the water, eking out a life in their confined pool long after their masters had faded away. The clouds of quartz and other strange crystal which had coated sections of the lake chamber roof reigned here as well, their soft glitter untainted by the smoke of long-dead fires. The giant woodlice were far more prolific, and bumbled aimlessly from mud patch to mud patch, perhaps feasting on guano from the hunting bats above. I watched each crevice for fishing antennae, and wheeled around to ensure at every corner that I was not followed through the dust-scattered ruin of the gloomy streets. The vague outline of what I took to be a spider half my size skittered across one of the distant quartz clouds overhead, but otherwise the sheen and patter of hunters was absent, and so far as the ground went, the suburb seemed remarkably safe. This cavern had only one other exit which was visible to me, and it was almost directly across from the one I'd come through. That end of the strange suburb was dominated by the most striking feature of the town, an overgrown and untended botanical display of some kind, which seemed mostly composed of fungal life. The largest of the mushrooms there were much like the ones I had seen in the desecrated temple the day prior, but these seemed to have flourished, and grown unhindered by pot or roof. Many soared the better part of 100 feet to the ceiling, and like their temple kindred, their gills gleamed down through the mist above like sunlight through cloud cover, half visible, but giving off enough violet ambient shine to leave that end of town almost well lit. These copses of mushrooms flanked either side of the causeway exit like guardians. The spiny and spongy foliage about their feet was dense, and shuffled occasionally as great millipedes as bumbling as their woodlice compatriots scuttled here and there in the damp cover. I stared into this fungal brush for a long while, debating whether I might gather fuel for a proper fire there. Eventually, though, in spite of the seemingly placid nature of the millipedes there, I opted not to risk the waist-high thickets, and instead turned for the exit to the tunnel. But I found that the comparative brightness of this suburb chamber had thus far blinded me to the most intriguing thing of all. For far down the causeway tunnel, sized identically to the menacing black gulfs which had opened before me in prior chambers, was a stark and strong glow. There was a light at the end of this tract of tunnel, and as I stood looking on in stunned silence, I realized it did not flicker or move. It was truly there, and moreover, it was not some potentially dangerous torch or lantern or luminescent hunter traversing the way up ahead. It was an opening onto real, bright light, the first I had seen in many days. I had not, I suppose, had a true goal since falling into the lake chamber, save, of course, survival. I had resolved to keep moving, but I had had no planned route, and had known nothing of real hope since my journey through this underworld had begun. Perhaps it was this long dearth of real hope that made me such a fool in that moment, for as I saw the light, I firmly took it to be the sun, an exit not just to the dark ruins in which I found myself, but to the caves as a whole. I felt warmth and the soft moisture of what I took to be open air as I began to sprint the length of the tunnel, heedless of sound, sprawling several times as I clipped rubble or remains in the deep shadows of the causeway. I smelled new and, to my desperate nose, floral scents, and heard running water as it cascaded down some great fall somewhere ahead of me. Freedom was here, I thought. I had been delivered. And yet, on some level, I had known all along that I must have been very, very deep down. Had I had the wherewithal to stop and think, it would have been obvious to me that this could not have been the light of the sun, and the warmth, so at odds with the blustery winter I had left behind overhead, could not be the heat given by the glorious light of a natural day. But my thirst for daylight and birdsong and breeze was so great that I allowed myself to be swept by it, down the tunnel, a full mile and more, until at last I burst from between two great shattered gates, waded through a tangle of bones and corroded weaponry, and found myself in the midst of a jungle, something akin to the descriptions of the great forests of the southern hemisphere. But drunk as I was upon hope, even I could realize that this was no ordinary forest. From thickets of fleshy fern-like growths that hung fat with moisture along the slick and soupy ground, soaring mushrooms and stalks of fungal growths rose like Titan trees, their bulbs and caps gleaming gold and red and purple through the mist that swirled overhead. Moss grew thick as grass here, and portions of the beds flared into dim green or yellow light before sinking into darkness, as if the whole biosphere thrummed with a single heartbeat, and the moss light was fed by it. Great petaled clusters of flower-like fungus which dripped and oozed the scents of sweetness and decay were capped with buzzing crowns of flies and other insects which feasted on their produce. A myriad of vines of some sort hung down from the clouds of moisture above, with glinting, bulbous protrusions shifting through a spectrum of vivid colors along their lengths, and hordes of half-glimpsed bats and bugs, some small as normal specimens, and some large enough to harry a grown man, darting between them. Spears of dark fungus grew like reeds alongside a true river, fed by a roaring waterfall a ways off which thundered down out of the haze overhead, and crashed into a rocky channel that carried the rush out of sight amidst the dazzling foliage. All this I drank in from a defensible platform halfway up the wall, occupied by the causeway exit. The forest occupied a cavern, but I knew it was far larger than even the lake chamber had been, even if the fog and mist of the waterfall made it impossible to guess exactly how large it was. The sound of massed animal life and roaring currents alone told me as much as it echoed endlessly in deafening symphony through the depths. So massive was it that it boasted a geography all its own, with the jagged cliffs and ledges of the walls giving the miles-long expanse the impression of a valley, and ragged hills of stone thrusting up from the jungle floor to tower unseen above, perhaps connected to the unglimpsed ceiling, like great cave columns. Had my brief fantasy of escape not rendered the discovery a disappointment, I might have seen the beauty in it, for despite the dangers I knew must lurk within, it was indeed beautiful. The inborn lights of its creatures and the fungal life growing therein gave the chamber the gleam of daylight, and their vivid colors danced in the mist, giving the vast space a surreal and ephemeral atmosphere, a dazzling array of moving colors and blinking lights that made my head spin after so long in the blackness. A ramp marked the end of the causeway, and I saw that below it had been mostly eaten by the fungal growth which dominated the chamber. The ruins of men beneath the stone, it seemed, were sometimes eaten away as effectively as they are in the light of day. But I didn't descend immediately. I had to lurk above, perhaps falsely confident due to my higher vantage point, and allow myself to come to terms with what I was seeing. As shock gradually wore off, my purpose became the planning of a route, and the careful observation of landmarks that might help me navigate once I was down in the tangle, and my line of sight became strangled in the jungle beneath the fungal canopy. I saw that there were long shapes stalking the riverbank, like giant serpents at first glance, but at length discernible as many-legged centipedes, which hunted the amphibians and woodlice and bloated grubs that writhed in the mud and guano there. Moreover, large translucent lurkers would occasionally surface from the water itself, glistening and beady-eyed, seeming to watch for prey along the shore. Slow and ponderous wasp things with glowing torsos as large as a man's flitted down from above the clouds and perched upon stones in the water to drink now and then, and huge crickets, perhaps juvenile examples of the stalker which had chased me from the city chamber, emerged from the brush for much the same reason. When prey was taken along the water, it was taken, for the most part, in silence, and offered no vocal protest to its killer as it was devoured, usually alive. The sheer tumult of motion down there meant that, despite the relatively easy navigation the riverbanks would provide, I would be a fool to travel alongside it for long. The forest itself, thickest in the lowest reaches of the cavern, was no better. Though one could not see the wildlife that hunted and died there from on high due to the sheer density of the growth, one could see it move now and then as a chase was initiated, or hear the clatter of disturbed mud and stone and fungus when one of the hunted fell victim to its pursuer. Some of these pursuers must have been heavy indeed, for their passing shook even the tree-sized mushrooms they brushed in passing. The mystery of what dwelt there was only half the horror that dissuaded me from navigating the valley floors of the chamber, for losing my way in so thick a tangle seemed inevitable, and given I didn't truly have any solid goal to begin with, such aimlessness seemed a death sentence. The sole survivable option seemed to me to be the cliffsides along the edges of the chamber. Their feet seemed still and placid by comparison to the rest of the landscape, and while I could not see the detail of them in the misty distance any better than I could observe the jungle floor below me, I was willing to gamble on a place I hoped was calm over the cavalcade of death I saw awaited me elsewhere. I resolved to descend the ramp from the gate platform, skirt the edge of the jungle around the carven base off to my left, and then find the cave wall behind and follow it around like a maze's outer edge. The mightiest of the columns of stone that soared for the unseen ceiling above in the middle distance was alive with swarms of some softly glowing fly, and I anticipated using its light as a sort of center point, a distant yardstick with which to measure my progress around the eaves of the cavern. With one last look over my shoulder into the blackness I'd left behind me, I doused the embers in my mushroom cap, carefully wrapped my candle into my pack with the rest of my supplies, and inched down the slick and treacherous ramp into the tangle, hammer at the ready. The first steps into the moss and lichen and fungal fronds that governed the ground were treacherous and slick, and that would frame my experience throughout the jungle caverns. The moisture and fleshy texture of even the leafy-looking fungal growth meant that each footfall pressed ooze from the undergrowth like blood from a broken body. Many times, when the growth was luminescent, the gleaming pigment would stain my soles for a time, and even when I managed to find rock outcrops and ridges to walk along, I would leave tracks along my path in a vivid gold or a noxious pink. Tiny mosquitoes, or something with similar habits, alighted on my exposed skin and drank deep, and each moment was spent swiping at my neck and hands, as much to disturb the feeding bugs as to wick away the sweat dragged out by the brutal humidity. Lightning bugs as tiny as gnats clogged up my eyes now and then, and had to be washed away in the waters of small feeder streams, which tumbled down the walls and cliff faces I hugged, leaving my eyes a watery and agitated mess. Centipedes lurched from crevices in the rock to strike at my hands as I grasped for stability on the ledges, and great army columns of glinting ants carrying spoils up the wall to unseen outposts above the mists were agitated to pursuit by my passing. A dragonfly as long as my arm made an unforeseen swoop at me from the mist overhead, but it had either mistaken me for something else or was scared by the wild swipe I took at it with my hammer, and after brushing my head with its long tail, it left for the heights and did not return. But the most repellent element of my trip along the cliffside walls of the jungle was the presence of another beast which I am unsure is a beast, for the more I have seen of it during my time underground, the less I believe it to be an animal at all. During a stop at a tiny waterfall amidst a clean crag and dark stone to drink, my shoulder was brushed from behind by a lithe and barely perceptible appendage, one I immediately assumed to be the feeler of some massive insectile hunter. But when I wheeled around, I at first saw only the bloated and malodorous fungal growth of the cavern. It was only when something twitched in the panoply of color that I realized there was a slow and ponderous giant right before me, half buried in the foliage, and so subtle in its motion that it seemed still if one did not watch it close enough. The giant was, to put it simply, a set of light and flexible limbs extended from beneath a mushroom cap the size of a small house back in Richmond. Despite the fact that these tender limbs were only a few inches thick, they must have been strong indeed, for they knelt and probed and slowly crept beneath the bulk of the fungal shell they carried, without wavering or trembling. There was no head to discern, nor was there a body save the mushroom cap. There was merely a thick nest of ragged tissue or tendrils hanging from beneath, into which the legs disappeared, a sort of terrestrial jellyfish. The legs and shape gave me the impression that it was a mighty crab, and the mushroom was its shell, but the lack of chitin on the limbs and the strange, almost accidental bumbling of the giant's movements dissuaded me from that notion over time. Since that first intrepid encounter, I have seen the things planted upon the corpses of the dead, or of the fallen fungal trees of the underworld. The crawling giants do not hunt, and do not move quickly enough to do so, and thus posed little danger to me in my travels. But as I have hinted, time has made me speculate they are not crabs or spiders at all, but rather a sort of carrion plant or fungus that has developed the ability to browse for new scavenged provender after its current source has been extinguished. Regardless, I describe it now from the relative safety of the present. In the moment, I had no time to muse on what it was. I just saw a gigantic crawler on the jungle's eaves, whose strange tendril limb had softly brushed me in the clamor of the chaotic fungal tangle, and I fled further on down the rocks, relieved to look back down the way and see that the giant was merely lingering about the falls, perhaps taking a drink. These crawling giants would rise up from the forest floor, sometimes indistinguishable from their immobile cousins, until the moment of motion, a sight I became accustomed to as I traversed the dense thickets about me. Some were large as whales or sailing ships, glimpsed like phantoms as they bumbled somewhere amidst distant mist, and others were no larger than a dinner plate. They paid no mind to the wildlife around them, or to my passing, and they only drew close when seeking water nearby. I, for my part, would have entirely disregarded them as harmless, which I suppose they are in truth, were it not for the indescribable stink that followed them. The fleshy brown or ochre mushroom caps upon the backs of the crawling giants were pockmarked with deep pores, and from these pores wept a sort of red or white ooze. It coated the caps and left a slick trail behind the giants as they shuffled from one place to another across the cavern floor. Other than to say the stink was of decay, I cannot go farther, for as I have said, it cannot be described. To attempt that is to lose the potent revulsion it inspires in translation to the page. What I will say is that I wept agitated tears from inflamed eyes, bled flowing mucus from an irritated nose, and vomited compulsively to the point of exhaustion the few times I was within several feet of the thing's slime trails, and learned well to steer clear of them after my first few encounters. During that first accidental meeting with one of the crawling giants, the symptoms were mild, for the quick retreat, and the fact it had been facing me on its approach to the water source, meant I did not garner much exposure to the ichor it expelled. But later stumbling along the cliff bottoms were not so fortunate, and the smaller specimens especially, their trails being harder to spot, made for many vomit-strewn detours along my treacherous trip. I traveled for many hours, taking rests only infrequently. One such rest was spent building a fire out of the fronds of a flaky and relatively dry fungal life form that grew like tiered shelving along the rocks at my side, over which I cooked the legs of the hunter I had slain along the causeway, which I glutted myself upon like an animal, watching jealously any movement in the scrub that hinted another might attempt to steal my meal. Occasionally a ruined building, clearly shaped by the same hands which had reared the cities at my back, reared up from the shroud of cloud and flora. But these were rare, and even more so than their cousins in the darker chamber, served now only as houses and hives for the great insect life hunting the valley floor. Every step of the way, whether in travel or reprieve, I kept my eyes on the largest central pillar miles distant, whose outline loomed mountain-like against the yellow-green haze, and whose location kept me roughly aware of the progress I'd made. I was exhausted by the time I reached the far end of the mighty room, and after miles and miles on my feet, fighting slick conditions and perching on smooth stone, I was near collapse. Exhaustion had set in, for it had been perhaps a day since I had slept. But there was no easy place I could spot to hole up or bed down, and I resolved to keep going, despite being near the end of my rope. The chamber's far end was a rough intersection with two other massive chambers, and the river which flowed through the first forked in half to carve its way into the further rooms. One was narrow by comparison to its fellows, only half a mile across, and seemed to taper off into an obscure, darker region ahead, whereas the other seemed to continue down a narrow canyon for a ways before opening up into a yawning jungle expanse as vast as the first. Not wishing to re-enter the dark, I chose the canyon route to the larger chamber. But the narrow nature of the connecting canyon meant I would have to climb back down to the lower reaches of the jungle, for the cliff faces I'd been hugging pinched the river tight in the gorge between rooms. As I approached, I saw less of the chaos the dense foliage along the banks had hosted elsewhere, and I told myself I might pass quick and unseen down the crag and be out and away before anything dangerous took notice of me. But I was noticed, and I would come to regret my assumptions. The hollow, reed-like fungal flutes that choked the waterway mostly died away in the crag, to be replaced by wispy blue and violet mushrooms about twice my height, whose caps were frilled with streamers that twitched and wobbled in the still air. The undergrowth was mostly rock, for the mud and muck seemed confined to the open riversides, but the rock was studded with barnacle things that probed the air with long tongues before snapping shut as one drew close. After reaching the riverside and testing that the moving tassels upon the mushrooms were not poisoned or otherwise hostile, my progress was spent crunching on these barnacle things, my feet aching in my boots as I strained my eyes against the myriad colors and tried to keep my wits about me. But the sickly sweet scent of distant death that haunted so much of the flora in this cavern system was thicker than ever in the crag amidst those blue wisps, and my head grew light. Colors danced at the corner of my vision, perhaps more vividly than was normal, and my skull, already racked with a tense headache born of the day's exertion, seemed ready to split with each pump of my slowing heart. My eyes watered slightly there, and as I recognized my situation and picked up my pace under the impression escaping the crag might alleviate the sensation, I slipped and slid more frequently, for my balance and reactions had sorely suffered. It felt as if my whole body was encased by mud, and the more energy I put into my increasingly drowsy push for the far end of the crag, and the gleaming promise of open space beyond, the more dreamlike and staid my attempts to move became. The trunks and streamers of the mushroom growths overhead, and the subtle mist rising off the river to my right, only enhanced my sleepwalker's sensations, and at length I went to my knees upon a flat ledge along the water, wary enough to find a safe place to balance, but desperate enough to catch my ever shallower breath to slow my progress through the chromatic manse. I was over halfway through, and yet the span before me up the river, more visible to me now that I had dropped low beneath the streamers, seemed insurmountable then. I could not walk straight or catch my breath, much less finish the run for the far side. Perhaps I could sleep, came the thought in my mind. Unwelcome there, but present all the same, as if it had been inserted through my ear by some hostile force to gnaw at the roots of my mind. My eyes were heavy, though. A small rest would not kill me now after so fortunate and fruitful a journey, I found myself thinking. And though the core of me cried out that I should not relent, my aching body seemed to move of its own accord, and I started to slump slowly down toward the cool, damp stone, as if meaning to sleep right there within arm's length of the water. Then I saw movement off to my side, a vision that cut through the haze of my foggy mental state like a knife to drag me some small fraction of the way back into wakefulness. Instinct runs strong in me. My years underground have certainly taught me that, and this was no exception. My blood pumping faster despite whatever spores or gases I was breathing in, and my vision clearing up just enough to give me a vague glimpse of what was coming for me. I had just come to lay on my side, my face against the rock of the shore, and my eyes cast outward over the calm surface of the river as it lazily drifted onward towards my destination at the end of the crag. A gray shape speckled with greens and whites, so similar to the rocky riverbed that it must have been invisible through the crystalline waters prior to making its move, broke the surface. It moved slowly and methodically, biding its time, apparently used to taking the beasts that wandered into its stretch of the river unaware and unprepared. As I twitched to try and snap myself into motion, and fought battles in my own mind against the dreamlike fugue that had overtaken me, the image of the thing from the water began to take shape. It was vaguely like a caterpillar, bloated and undulating, seeming to swell and deflate in places as whatever internal mechanisms moved it shifted it along. It had horns and ridges along its back, some of which flared red with excitement as it slouched forward through the water. This vile body, still mostly obscured by the sheen of the surface of the water, was fronted by a thick and bulbous sort of head, from which glinted asymmetrical clusters of tiny black eyes. This head was gelatinous, and rippled and molded itself to its purpose just like the rest of the thing's body. There was no visible mouth, not at first, but the thing's slow yet steady motion would soon reveal one to me. I had just managed to lift myself up onto one weak elbow and feebly slide an inch or two back from the water when the beast hit the incline of rock upward to the shoreline, and rose further from the current as it began to crawl rather than swim. I had known it was large, but I then saw it was huge. Water spilled from its grotesque bulk as it ascended, seeming more a maggot than a caterpillar now that I saw the sheer fatty mass of it, segmented like a worm, but barbed with thousands of translucent hairs or spines about its larger crests of red that twitched eagerly as it gave sluggish chase. Rather than the legs of a centipede or the pads of a caterpillar, it had many rows of stunted flippers, and they slapped the stone in a slipshod rhythm as it dragged itself inch by inch onto land. It reared up like a snake as it did so, and I saw that beneath the rubbery camouflage of its back, the underbelly was flaring red like glistening blood, and rippled with some sort of teeth or claws that I imagined it must use to grip the riverbed, and, I supposed, its victims. Clearly visible now as it stood like a striking cobra, beneath the head where those awkward clusters of black eyes glistened and rolled, I at last saw its mouth. The creature was so unlike anything I have seen, even allowing for my former obsession with the texts of naturalists, that I have had some trouble attempting to put its shape into words. But the mouth tests me even more. Best as I can describe, it was a shuddering hole, a sort of sphincter, expanding and contracting. Several tendrils, perhaps tongues or stingers or graspers, flitting in and out as it moved. Rows of ridged things which were not quite teeth were occasionally visible dilating and spasming within, disappearing away into the throat. At one moment, the mouth would be large enough to swallow a man whole. The next, it would be a slit no larger than a coin stood on its end, so subtle that a man might miss its presence. It was agonizingly close to me then, at most 15 yards away, still trailing water. I had tried twice to get my feet under me again, but they were prickly, as if I had been sitting on them at an odd angle, seeming even weaker than before. Thus, I'd settled on backpedaling along the stone on my rear, dragging my hammer and pack pinned under one arm, and scuttling bug-like with my 3 free limbs in a desperate attempt to move. But despite my ridiculous mode of escape, it moved so very slowly that the feeble backpedal I was in kept the distance between us roughly even. The beast would inch forward, body rippling, making no noise save the trickle of water from its glistening flanks and the slap of its flippers upon the stone. and in turn, I would kick off the earth and drag at the stalks of mushrooms with filthy hands, gaining a few inches of my own. Hugging the riverbank so I did not lose my way, and breathing more and more raggedly as I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder into the distance, where the bluish hue of the crag's wispy mushrooms died away, reminding myself I was already over halfway there, and praying whatever effect the area had on me waned fast once I was out. Slowly toppling mushrooms in my wake, the riverbed slug kept pace, its mouth still ululating in a silent, hungry scream. Sad as this snail's marathon sounds, it was nightmarish to run it. As in Nightmare, I was weighed down with artificial chains, and felt at each moment that my pursuer was within arm's reach of me, and sometimes I was right. Twice the beast let its forebody slap down against the stone, making a lunge as if to crush me beneath it and bring its mouth down upon me. But both times it missed my kicking feet by a hand's length at most. In the time the beast would take to right itself and begin its pursuit in earnest again, I would have gained a few yards, and the cycle would begin again. I cannot say how I mustered the focus to remain conscious throughout that awkward chase. Perhaps terror alone carried me through, as I slid back or rolled onto all fours to clamber over rock mounds in the glaring fog. More of the things, most small by comparison to the titan that still lumbered after me, broke the water now and then as we passed. Though they were too slow to catch up and threaten me as the first had, this omnipresent menace perhaps aided me in maintaining my focus for the whole of the sleepy scrabble through the crag. Whether by grace or due to the sheer animal drive to survive another day, I eventually scrambled with bloody hands and ragged trousers into the comparatively open air of the next jungle cavern. But I did not stop there to bask, for the slug thing was still close on my heels. I crawled for some time, clinging up along the base of the cliffs as I had done in the previous jungle expanse, and ignoring the burning in my shredded skin and straining lungs. I did not hear its slapping slither give chase for some time, but my heart still beat hard in my chest, and my mind had no room for doubt which might see me killed. But long minutes saw me come to a breathless halt along the cave wall, pinned, as I saw a crawling giant and its slick trail of grime submerged in a shallow stream with many juveniles up ahead. Wishing to avoid any further poison than whatever already troubled me, I threw my eyes around in search for escape amongst the tangle of jungle along the slope downward towards the riverside. But I glimpsed no red flares of motion behind me, and, exhausted, sat in silence for a long moment of disbelief, waiting for the slug thing to emerge from the fungal scrub, or crest some jagged hillock in the stony ground. It never appeared, though. Both the slug and the blue canyon in which its kindred thrived in the calmest reaches of the river were now out of sight through the mist and intervening terrain. Shapes which were not there still danced in the far corners of my vision, and a weariness which was not wholly of exhaustion still clouded my thoughts. With the stink of the crawling giants not far off, but simultaneously not so vitriolic that it affected me, I found a small crevice in the stone wall a few dozen yards from them. I was beneath a small overhang, which kept the gravel beneath relatively dry. My head still spinning, I shoved some of this gravel up from my chosen bed to form a loose barrier between me and the cavern beyond. Far from sturdy, but it was all I could manage as my limbs shook and my hands struggled to make intricate motions. I was glad to be in darkness for the first time since coming into the caves. I pressed the jacket pack to the ground as a sort of shoddy, uncomfortable pillow. I had just enough time as consciousness left me to realize the hammer I had carried was no longer with me, almost certainly dropped or jostled loose from my weak grip during the chase. But the lack of a weapon would not truly frighten me until I awoke much later, in a state of better clarity. Right then, I knew only groggy misery, and sleep seemed the only cure.